I'm Robin Frey-Carey, CEO of Social Media Today, and I'd like to welcome you to today's first, and the only one open to non-members, Social Business Book Club Hangout on the air. We are very lucky to have two of the most talented, insightful authors in our stable of great book authors. They are Peter Ryder and Bastian Unterberg, who have written Crowdstorm, The Future of Innovation, Ideas, and Problem Solving. Thank you so much, guys, for having us, for being part of this hangout today. Really appreciate it. I know that you guys are, one of you is having to come in from way away from Germany, and I think that we're going to get a great conversation going. I've read the book. It's fantastic, and I encourage everyone on the call who hasn't to join the book club so that you can not only read Crowdstorm, but you can read a whole 5 other really super books coming out of Wiley. But let's get started, guys, by finding out from you, what was the impulse behind writing this book?
So I'll take a first stab at it. And I think there's a couple of ways to think about why we came to it. Over the last maybe 5 to 10 years, we've seen open innovation and we've seen crowdsourcing out there in the marketplace. And as we see with any sort of innovation that's taking place, whether it's from a technology standpoint or a business sort of standpoint, things go through a cycle. That cycle, you know, if you go way back to the 90s and you look at Jeffrey Moore's book, Crossing the Chasm, there's sort of this cycle where you've got innovation and then you've got early adopters and you've got, you know, late stage adopters and maturity and et cetera. And you know what we saw in this space was something that was following this pattern, and that was you had this really massive reimagination that was sort of fueled by some really great people and academics that were thinking about this, but just technology. I mean, what we talked about at the beginning of our pitch last time was technology has really allowed for the ability for organizations to reach out at scale to access creative talent in a way that they were not capable of doing before. What happened, okay, was sort of in the crowdsourcing 1.0 phase of this, people went out and looked for ideas. I think what they found very quickly was not only could they get ideas, but they could get a whole lot more. They could get feedback. They could use crowds to help vet kind of things, and then a whole series of interesting things started happening. And what you saw, going back to the Jeffrey Moore, is what you saw was sort of the technology and capability set outstripping the process. In other words, there's a set of processes, okay, that need to kind of work individually and in a holistic way to be successful. And when you make a miss, the misses are, you know, we've seen them in the news. And so we stepped back and we said, let's look, right, and let's put a little bit of a sort of systemization behind what these processes are, okay. This is not, technology enables this, but it's really the processes that you put in place. It's how you ask questions to 1,000 people that you don't know. How do you incent them? How do you recruit them? How do you keep them? How do you build a community? How do you have an active and ongoing relationship with a bunch of people, okay, that you don't know? And so that was really the genesis of the book. And as we thought about it, we said, let's look at the individual parts that make this work, and then let's look at it holistically and try to make it work. So that's really where it came from. And so what we tried to do is put that sort of, you know, that practical sort of framework around all this terrific thinking and theory and experimentation that have been taking place out there. Big organizations in the academies, you know, in Berlin and the U.S., tremendous amounts of great thinking going on, tremendous amounts of money being invested, and lots of big companies trying this stuff out on an experimental basis. And so what we think the book does is it sort of sets that foundation for an ongoing discussion around how do you put this stuff practically, okay, into the hands of organizations who want to make fundamental changes in the way that they do their, you know, reimagine their R&D, reimagine their marketing space. And we think that it hopefully provides the basis for that.
Yeah.
Is that what motivated you as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing. We learned that the ability to solve problems, especially when it's complex problems, increases with collaboration, with the degree of collaboration. So we learned over time that collaboration nurtures solutions. And writing the book is sort of our way to collaborate with other thinkers in this space in order to share our experiences, get their feedback, and take it to the next level. So we're also doing this for us, and also in order to give something back.
Well, that sort of leads to an interesting question. As a consequence of writing the book, what have you learned, and what have you heard in the way of feedback about your thoughts, and are you continuing to evolve your thinking as a result of publishing the book?
So I actually found out about at least 100 cases that I wasn't aware of before. And it happens every week that someone shoots me an email, and I figure out on a small scale within smaller firms and organizations, on a larger scale, community-driven work. So it's really exciting for us to see like this broad spectrum of things that are happening out there, and it's increasing at a phenomenal speed right now. The other things that we learned or pretty much validated is the importance of community management, of intermediating the process. If hundreds or thousands of people share their thoughts, discuss problems, discuss solutions, work together, this is coming at some costs. And although the transaction costs are not as high as in the traditional non like digital age, it's still necessary to intermediate opinions, to make sure that the atmosphere remains positive, that people are motivated in this environment to contribute. And I think that is one of the core learnings that we also see looking at cases which simply go wrong.
Yeah, I just want to interrupt slightly to welcome anyone listening in to use the Q&A tab or box on the left-hand side. Just click on that and ask questions of Bastian and Peter at any time. We're going to make this a very interactive discussion. And welcome, Ken Daniele. Thank you for raising your hand. So feel free to ask questions of these two very smart people. So interesting.
I was going to add one thing just to follow up on your question. You know, I've been out and I've given a couple of talks at conferences and given some talks at NYU here and to the master's program talking about this. And there's a general and genuine interest in this. I think one of the interesting findings for me was when you get participation up to a certain level and you track that participation. So you're not just tracking ideas, but you're tracking the ways that people provide feedback and do evaluations. When you start analyzing that, it's interesting, and these are people that in the NYU Master's program in particular, one of the things that they found interesting is when you're doing this within an organization, it provides you with a lens that you didn't have before to look at your people in the organization. So if you've got this sort of an internal base, we know this on the outside, folks like Javoto capture information around their crowd, but when you do some of this stuff internally, you have access now to a whole interesting view of your employees, right? And not just because a lot of the stuff that happens in an organization happens in these sort of brainstorming settings. People come up with ideas, but then ideas are discarded. People participate and give good evaluation and feedback, but then it doesn't really get into their evaluation. And if you capture this information, okay, on an ongoing basis, you have a very interesting perspective, a new and broader perspective about the sort of capabilities, the creative capabilities, the participation and collaboration capabilities, which are so important in today's organization. That was a really interesting finding for me. A lot of people pointed that out, that if you could really put this in from an overall sort of structural basis in and around organizations, you have a really different lens than the traditional lenses of evaluations of people, you know, and HR and all that kind of stuff, because you've really captured the work. You've captured the good work, you've captured the bad work, you've captured the work that doesn't make it, you know, into the proposal, it ends up in the trash can, but it's still good quality stuff. And this mechanism, this tool, and these processes provide for that. And it's a very interesting sort of notion, I think.
Yeah, I mean, let's dig a little bit into the tools and processes that you talk about in your book, because I think everyone well, not everyone. Certainly, IP attorneys might not buy into your thesis, but it seems to be a no-brainer, and yet understanding it conceptually and actually implementing a plan for crowdsourcing or collaboration across all these various silos is actually really hard, because I think when you talk to companies and you talk to CEOs or CMOs and they say yeah, but I mean you're coming up against structures and ways that organizations have formed themselves over centuries that are very, very hard to change. So what is it? What's happening now? What do we have in the way of technologies and tools that make this more possible? And processes.
Well, here's go ahead, Bastian. Go ahead.
I think technologies and tools are always the second step. The first step is when an organization is looking at a certain challenge and they're thinking about organizing a crowdstorm to solve this. The first step is to understand a crowdstorm as a crossover initiative internally. So here at Javoto, we run hundreds of crowdstorms for larger organizations, and we often realize that it sparks within product development, within R&D. There's a tough nut that needs to be cracked, and we put those projects out there, and they become a communication case. But for the product and R&D department, it's very challenging to speak the same language as the marketing department. But the marketing department gets the press coverage, the track record, and is sometimes really happy about the earned media and the outcome. But often it's not streamlined, doesn't live up to the brand's communication strategy. So, and those conflicts, I think, should be considered first before you think about technology, before you think about actively connecting maybe your brand communities, maybe your Facebook fans, to evaluate the outcome of a crowdstorm that you ran with a community like Javoto, or with a technology provider and an outreach that built your own community of experts. So I think first it's really understanding what kind of impact do you expect or you're looking for your organization, and then it's a second step to look at technology and infrastructure to use.
Yeah, but so what's substantially different? What do you talk about in the book that management can now use to further greater collaboration that they didn't have 10, 15 years ago?
I mean, from a technology standpoint?
Or a process standpoint as well. But I guess it's hard to separate one from the other.
Well, I think, so there's a third component, which is a cultural standpoint as well. But so if, and you have to get culturally your mindset around the fact that you are, look, on one end of this, on the spectrum, you are, as an organization, you spent, okay, the last, however long you've been in existence, okay, before you had the advent of tools and devices that allowed you to connect very easily, okay, to a massive number of people anywhere at any time. Okay, but you have an organization from a cultural standpoint and from a business process standpoint that says, we've hired the best people, those people are in our organization, and we should be able to solve these problems. And yet at the same time, people come up with the dilemma of, well, let's see, I can't get my product throughput, done fast enough. My speed to innovation is not at what I promised to the marketplace. So you have on the one hand, you have the traditional way that we've done business, and on the other hand, you have some business imperatives, and you have a culture, and depending on that type of culture and the type of leadership in that organization that's willing to say, we've got to do something different. How are we going to manage these two different conflicting things we have? We've got this sort of organization that's sort of this view of how we should be doing things. We have these imperatives out here. We now have this technology that we see, and look, at the technology's been there for a long time. I mean, you can do this stuff with Yammer. You can do this stuff with, SharePoint. Easy stuff. That's easy stuff, right? What you can't do, okay, culturally, is get your organization to say, we've got to shift our gears, right? We have to open ourselves up. That's a risk, and that risk has multiple components. You're right. One of them is lawyers talking about IP. You've got brand managers saying, well, what will happen with our brand if we open things up? You've got other people saying, what about confidentiality? So you've got a cultural, you've got a technology, okay, and you've got a process change that you have to have your organization go through. And I think what Bastian is pointing out is, some of that is just conflicts within the organization between marketing and the product teams. Those people have to align. There needs to be some leadership in the organization that says our business imperatives are such that we've got to take this next step. And then we've got to look out, okay, to people who have done this before, who can bring us, okay, some just like what they would do with any, like 20 years ago when they were looking at accounting systems, right? Somebody's had to say, there's new ways from a technology standpoint to do our accounting, and there's some new processes we need to put into place. Well, it's the same thing that's taking place here on the innovation front. There are new processes, there's new technology, and there's some new governance models, some new cultural models that our legal teams, that our brand managers, that our sort of cultural managers around not invented here syndrome have to get through. And once they get through that, and once they see that this is a supplement, okay, to what they're doing, not a substitution. This is just another arrow in the quiver in what they're doing in terms of their innovation, accessing talent to help their talent sort of either get ideas that they can take forward, or find new talent to bring into the organization, which is often the case, okay, with some of this stuff. Many organizations, okay, we talk about a number of them in the book, where people are not looking for ideas necessarily, but they're looking for talent, okay, either to invest in, to buy, to bring in-house. So there are a variety of different, I think what we're discovering is that there's a variety of different things that this process, technology, and sort of kind of new kind of milieu to play in, lots of different ways to play in it, right? Once you get your head wrapped around it.
Can our producer, Amelia, can you get back to Ken? He's having some trouble. He has a question about whether or not he can see the other attendees, and I frankly don't know how to help you, Ken. So if Amelia could get back to you on that. Let's try to use the Q&A for questions for the writers. This will be recorded, and so anybody who's having any connectivity problems will be able to look at the entire video when it's posted on YouTube, and we'll be sure to send our invites out to see that on YouTube. So, guys, what's driving this? Are large global corporations perceiving that their ability to get their head around crowdstorming is going to be a competitive differentiator? I mean, they're probably coming kicking and screaming into this new world, right? I mean, is it simply because they feel they have to? Is it a necessity, or do they see something more desirable on the other side of it?
What we realize is that the world is opening up. This carries a tremendous potential for large organizations and for us as individuals. Robin, for you, for your business, people are sharing thoughts. They're more accessible. They're connected. And organizations who do understand this, they gain a competitive edge. And when it comes to crowdstorming, what we saw in the early years, about 7-8 years ago, most large organizations and corporates were running test cases. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
They were very hesitant in terms of delivering promises to the crowd. It was basically riding a bus, riding a wave, an initial wave, testing it. In 2010 and 11, we saw that the kind of problems or tasks that these organizations started to put in front of outside talent became much more substantial. Mm-hmm. The one-off PR and marketing stunts, like the crowdsourcing campaigns, which often failed, changed. The core of the question became something that was substantial for the corporation's business, not just a PR matter. That started to happen in 2010, 2011, whereas now, at least for our company, we see ourselves in discussions with these larger organizations where it's really about designing KPIs to measure the performance of outside talent, to understand the interface between outside talent and the own organizations. Pete mentioned it, HR, recruiting,
right.
is becoming more and more important. And then there are companies and brands like Lego with their QSO platform, who started very early, who kept on learning, and who are now driving substantial business and product sourcing through their communities. And for Lego, it's a great brand with a great global community and fan base. I have 2 little kids, and I'm sort of getting back to playing Lego now every day.
Yeah, when will you have to pick that stuff off the carpet? Oh.
So I think if you are a brand with such a community, there is the potential to leverage your own community in order to source innovation, product ideas, gain their feedback, and this will impact your business in a tremendously positive way. For many brands who do not have those active communities, those passionate users, they can look at platforms out there who do manage communities, who nurture spirit amongst the community. I'm thinking of platforms like Threadless, a design community, where it's more about t-shirt design. I'm thinking about platforms like Quickie. We're partnering with General Electric, for example, in order to source product ideas and appliances, or platforms like Javoto, where you don't have to constantly pay for community management, for keeping the community active, and for making sure that the best talents remain loyal members of the community. You can just have a flexible access to talent and pay when you need those creative minds to work for you. So that's the 2 directions which I see. Either there is a setup, and that's much more dependent on what kind of community you already have, what kind of enthusiasts around your brand or your products already exist, or you look at existing communities, and there it's very important to look for culture, for shared values amongst the community. How open, how transparent, how collaborative is the model? Do you have the impression when looking at the community that the community is really part of this company? That the border between community and service provider who provides access to the community is sort of seamless? Or is it platforms who are simply marketplaces, like 99 Designs, where you source a logo design and it's basically the buyer's call to make a decision in the end. So it's a cultural thing. It's a lot about values, because if you have a strong brand, you want to make sure that you tap into an environment that's positive for your brand.
But if you say from an organization, do organizations consider this at this point in the maturity, of this a differentiator? I think there are examples that we try to point out in the book, and that we talked a little bit about last time. If you get someone like P&G that says, whose CEO says, I'm going to move my organization from a 90-10, percentage split of 90% of R&D in-house, 10% outside, to 50-50, and he does that, by 2011 by using open innovation and crowdstorming to do it, then that's a fundamental change. And he basically says, I need more product throughput, and the only way to do that is to tap into people who, in many cases, and there are many examples, where they've already solved a problem, somebody externally has already solved the problem that these guys are looking for. Same thing with CMix. That recognition, and as that becomes more kind of ingrained, in people, in the sort of the enterprise world's mindset, they will see this as another tool, an important tool in being able to sort of move the needle, on innovation. If you think about, enterprises, they've moved the needle on everything else in their organization, their supply chain, their administration, marketing, in the world of R&D, in the world of and sort of in the sort of high end of marketing, those things haven't changed that much, and it's only been in the last 5 to 10 years. And the opportunity to do that by accessing talent at scale has sort of taken hold, and that's took hold first from a technology standpoint. Now it's taking hold from a process standpoint, and you're going to see people recognizing when this can be a differentiator for them, when they don't need to use it, and they're going to do some things in-house. And that's sort of always the process. Going back to that maturity curve, people are in that maturity curve, finding out where are those places where we can get that massive sort of change that we want.
So we're moving from essentially from it being pilot stage to truly operational, and you gave some great examples and you talk about those companies in the book. So as it moves into operational, do the best practices become something that companies are holding on to? I mean, I would imagine that could be a competitive advantage. If I were P&G and I figured out how to effectively run my online communities, I wouldn't want Colgate-Palmolive to know. I mean, am I right? Is this now a new kind of competitive differentiator?
Look, I think jury's still out how it's all going to work. And best practices, I would say, are a little ways off. We hope that the book provides the framework for the best practices, because I think that's what it was based on. But they are continuing to evolve, and platforms like Javoto, et cetera, are the technology that continue to evolve with them, right? I mean, as you see the need from a process standpoint the reason why folks like Javoto are around is because there was a need for that. I mean, when you have complex community management sort of issues, you need a platform to do that. You can't use SharePoint or Yammer, right? You can do that to get ideas, but you can't do it to build complicated communities.
Yeah, let me interrupt and just make sure our audience knows that, Peter, you were the president of Javoto, and Bastian is still there. What about Javoto and other very Quirky you mentioned is another one that are really robust collaborative platforms? What are you guys doing that the Jives and the SharePoints are not doing? What are you doing that is truly different? It's a chance for you to talk about Javoto, among other things.
I'll start and let Bastian give more detail. I think what sort of built for this sort of environment platforms do is they take into account the full process lifecycle that we try to lay out in the book, and that is everything from how you ask the right question, get the right incentives, more importantly, establishing which kind of relationship you want with your community, building community management practices into it, and hugely importantly, what are the analytics that you want, right, to manage your community? What are those components that are important to your community, and how do you manage them? And then allowing for that sort of back-end selection process, and then keeping all that stuff, and then building an internal network so that the community can talk to each other. That is not easy. That is a very hard thing from a technology standpoint, and then building all those things from a social media standpoint so that people can come in and out, and you can segment and nest, the way that you want to. That is a huge difference, right? And it may on the surface not look like that. It's like any of those technologies from the past, right? Things look like they're solving the problem, but really when you get down and you look at the processes, those are very complicated things to manage, right? And that's what I think things like Javoto and what Quirky and those guys, they figured that stuff out. Those are differentiators, right? Because they allow you to do things, and then by extension allow you to, once you get to a certain point, if you want to take over and do that stuff yourself, you can add stuff on it that's, geared towards you.
Right. I mean, this is so similar in so many ways to conversations we have on social media today about outsourcing your customer communities. Do you outsource or do you insource? At what point do you do that? And that's, I think, part of the innovation cycle as well. But we do have a question, and it's a great one from Ken. Ken Daniele asks, how does a company obtain full ownership of ideas that come from the outside? Great question.
Great question. So continue. I'll let Bastian take it.
There's different ways to organize ownership and IP rights of ideas if those ideas have copyright. So there's platforms who generally say everything that you submit, we're going to own it. So this is not really in the interest of those who collaborate and participate on the platform. It's giving away upfront all the rights of their work, and usually you don't attract the best talent. The best talent is much more critique and looks at the circumstances, the attributes in the environment, and has an intuitive understanding of whether this is a fair ground or not.
Mm.
Then immediately
Okay,
impact.
all right. But let's put a pin in that, because
Yeah.
that's a sort of interesting question. I mean, what about it is intuitive, and how do you go to a corporate executive and try to explain that one away? I'm sorry.
Mm. It's, maybe I can use an easy example. So there's a playground, and you see lots of people having fun. Yeah, and the vibe is very positive. Is this intuitively giving you a positive feeling to join? Versus there is a space that is intransparent. You don't really understand what's going on, but you're requested to give away your passport and your bag at the entrance, and we'll let you know later maybe what's going on the playground. So this is what I mean by intuitive feeling. And this is what we experience when working with communities. You get it immediately. Like, you see how people are participating. You learn quickly about how people interact with each other. Is it respectful? Do they help each other? Is this a positive feeling? Or is everybody fighting against each other with their own idea, thinking they have the best concept? And I believe, back to the question, it's this makes the difference when it comes to solving different kind of problems. For small problems, you do not need a level of engagement or collaboration necessarily. But if you look at more complex problems, if you look at problems where different disciplines or experts are needed, and if it's required that these experts spend hours talking together, discussing, iterating on their concepts, then they want to know if their IP is protected or not. Mm-hmm. What are the rules for their engagement? Mm-hmm. So we organize it in a way where we say everybody who's working here keeps the rights of their work. Mm-hmm. But before we start a process, a project, we make all terms transparent, including the licensing process. That means, for example, if Audi is sourcing product innovation ideas, and we clearly know what the problem is that is going to be solved, we can describe the amount of license fee that will be transferred when a concept is going to be used by Audi. And so we manage the whole licensing and IP process in the background, but everybody who comes to the project knows all the terms. And if they think that my idea is worth more, they don't have to participate. They can then send an email to us with their idea and try to get it in front of the client in a different way, which we usually don't do because of the amount of overhead that's involved with it. But it's important that everybody is able to make an informed decision, the client as well as the participant in the process. And that in the end, licensing.
A process that has to be continually reinforced. I mean, in the context of community, if a member makes a contribution, is that contribution consistently sort of evaluated? Do you have to remind the participant, oh, well, you know, in this particular context, if you put forth this idea, the community, it will become public. You will not own it anymore, or it will become part of some larger solution. I mean, it would seem to me that that could be very challenging, and I know that that's what we invented technology for, was just those sorts of challenges. But is that sort of how it works? I'm trying to sort of visualize.
So, of course, we track what happens with an idea. On our platform, it's possible to form teams around an idea, so there's shared ownership in the idea, and there are rules for the shared ownership as well when it comes to distributing license fees to the owners of the idea. And everything is tracked. So you publish your idea, you have a timestamp, you have witnesses, we have various law firms that we're collaborating with when, in case the questions come up and we need to clarify them quickly. We make sure that everything is handled as quickly as possible before something gets dynamic.
Right. I mean, speed is really of the essence, isn't it? Because if you start to bog down the community with a lot of delays and with a lot of barriers, you're really defeating the purpose, aren't you?
Absolutely.
Peter, you want to add to that?
Well, I was going to try to just a couple of points, right? So going back to the original question, there's what I was going to say was there is this continuum, right? And this is what an if you look at it from we can look at it from two perspectives. Bastian, I think, was really pointing out the perspective of the creative, right, and how you get as much interest from them as possible. And then you've got the organization. Organization, when they think about IP, you're exactly right. You run into the legal departments all the time around how they want to manage IP. And how open they want to be is going to dictate where in that continuum of what you're going to do from an IP standpoint you're going to end up. On one end, I think Bastian's point is if you are open, okay, to doing this, you're going to allow the retention of IP, okay, with the user until somebody actually purchases it. If you're on the other end of this perspective, and this is where somebody like P&G started, okay, they said, okay, one, we expect if you're going to send something into us, it already is patent or patentable, right? So you've already got some sort of legal sort of recourse. If it's not, then we're going to own it by you submitting it.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit further down, if you're in that GE example that we gave, okay, you retain ownership, but we have the opportunity to invest in you. Okay, so there's going to be an investment. If you're like we give an example about the Innocentive, another platform. Those guys say, you know, you've given us a royalty-free, non-exclusive license by submitting this, right? But the only people that are going to see it are us and the sponsor, so it's not going to be open. So you've limited how open this is. Mm-hmm. Where Javoto comes from, you're saying, we're going to make this as open as possible because creatives, they don't want their ideas stolen, okay? But they want to retain ownership, and it's going to make them feel more creative and more open to sharing. Because remember, one of the incentives is they get attention, whether they win or lose, right? They're out there. People see their stuff. And that's exciting. That's an important part. That is a part of being open. So on the continuum as an organization, you have to figure out where you are. You also, the only other point that I'd make to the question is, not everything is IP, right? If you phrase a question and you say, if you basically look at, okay, we need some concepts. We need some napkin sets. We don't need a prototype here. We want some ideas to get us going. And a lot of organizations, Javoto does this, IDEO does this. They have a phase where it's just, you know, concepts. Well, okay, we don't have to worry from a legal standpoint about IP when it comes to concepts, right? Concepts are not patentable. They're not IP, right? And from a confidentiality standpoint, if you open this up and some other organization sees that you're interested in this space, you have to weigh whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing in terms of is it more important for you to get great ideas, or somebody could possibly think that you're headed into the power grid space. Well, I think organizations are finding that castle mentality, okay, is counterproductive to some of the business needs in terms of speed to innovation that they need. And I think this is a little bit of a gray, not a little bit, it is a gray area that from a legal standpoint and a business standpoint and a cultural standpoint you have to figure out. You are right in your question. You're going to get lawyers and we all get them all the time saying, we're not doing this because, okay, we can't control the IP. There's so many different ways to skin this cat. We point out many, many different examples of the book of ways to do this. The other thing I might add, we start off in the legal section about Apple, the most IP-sensitive, litigious group in the world. Just read the paper this week about the Samsung thing that's still going on. So they have that, and they are hugely creative and hugely sensitive about their product. What did they do to do open innovation? They've got 400,000 application builders that extend their product every day, and they pay them billions of dollars. So they've figured out this problem for themselves the way that they want to. So people do tend to sort of work. I throw that as a sort of extreme example. It is possible to find the way through this. And I think that Bastian lives through this stuff now every day, trying to work through it. People find that when they get to a certain point in the process, the value of this tends to outweigh some of those entrenched cultural things that they feel afraid of, okay, or their legal departments and their risk managers have been responsible for dealing with. And I think that's a maturity. That's a maturity, right, in the enterprise.
It's the classic, the value of my cell phone outweighs the problems that the technology presents and the bad call quality and all that sort of thing. I mean, you're right. Let me throw you I think because as some of you may have picked up, I'm suffering from hay fever, and Peter and I shared earlier that we're both suffering from hay fever. I think in the book you talk a little bit about, what about global problems? I mean, what if we use this model to tackle something like climate change, which is causing Peter and my hay fever? I mean, what are the possibilities for something really extraordinary here using your platforms that are provided by technology, but this kind of model?
So we actually gained some experience being involved in some of those kind of challenges, solve wicked problems for humanity, for our global society, as an advisor or as a contractor with our technology and community. I think that the number one outcome of organizing a Crowdstorm at the beginning of the solution finding process is you connect hundreds of thousands of people around the world who are interested in this topic. Companies who provide maybe components to a solution. It's experts who provide knowledge. It's people who just spread the word, who help to take this to a visible level. It's governmental organizations, it's foundations. You basically bring together a lot of different entities and people, which increases the chances for finding solutions that are viable enough to be tested, prototyped, and taken forward. We work with Greenpeace, for example, looking at a problem in India, like 10 million dirty diesel pumps to irrigate small fields. Farmers are using these 10 million diesel pumps every day, whereas they have more than 320 days sunshine, and solar energy can be used instead of diesel fuel to power those pumps, those water pumps. But it's actually a design problem and a missing ecosystem now in India. So that leads to kind of containing the problem. People stick to diesel pumps, although there's solar panels, there's technology available. So how can we solve this? It was an interesting project where the Indian government was involved, Greenpeace as a global organization, consultancies, technology consultancies, institutions who provided funding in order to take the most inspiring solutions forwards into a prototyping process. We flew architects, engineers, designers to India to meet farmers locally. So I think a Crowdstorm is offering the highest potential at the very beginning of the process, whereas the difference will be made if people start abandoning diesel pumps, right? So it actually happens when people change behavior and when new technology, for example, becomes adopted. And this is something that no community can solve through an online space. That's what I believe.
I think the opportunity is great, and I also think that the world community of innovators and creative people are dying to do it. People want to work on good problems, right? Mm-hmm. It's funny that I feel like you've teed us up. Bastian and I just received an email today from the office, let's see, it's the Assistant Director of Grand Challenges, Office of Science and Technology Policy, Executive Office of the President Obama. So this is about the federal government. Okay, they've run recently. This is Obama's deal for innovation centers. Okay, and it's wrapped around the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and it's an update. Okay, on the last report detailing use prizes and competitions. I think they've run for 20. They've run 87 open source competitions at 25 federal agencies. So that's a recent report. We'll send that along to you can see. So people in the government, okay, who I think are beginning to think about this, are evolving how they want to address these kinds of issues. City of New York does it around big apps. So they've got a sort of open source, crowdsource around big app applications that can solve city problems. Cities and municipalities, when there's some problems around procurement and how they do it, if they can get it sorted, they can tap into really the vast sort of resources, not only from their own communities, but from communities around the country to solve these sorts of things. So I think it is it is a ripe, okay, area for doing this. And the broader you can create an ecosystem of communities, tie communities together. So you've got a behavioral science community over here, you've got a Javoto creative community over here, you've got a product group over here, tying those communities together in interesting ways so that they can focus and you can share that information. There's a future, okay, in that. I mean, there's a next level here where you've got massive community sharing in ecosystems, or communities of ecosystems, that I think is very interesting, right? And this is one of these things that governments, have the capability of putting together in a meaningful way. And people like in Germany are I think, probably ahead of where the U.S. is in some of this thinking.
Interesting. So, Ken, I'm sorry. No, the climate change thing was not a joke. According to the report yesterday in the New York Times, climate change is creating more severe cases of hay fever. But it's not something that I would equate with living in Bangladesh or the Seychelles Islands in terms of its inconvenience, but it's kind of a problem right now. And I apologize if I've coughed too much in our hangout here. All right, so let's start to wrap this up, gentlemen. We've gone past pilot to operational. We're beginning to develop best practices. We're beginning to understand as companies how this is critical to competitive advantage. Governments are beginning to understand that they can solve problems here. What's the future? Will this be de facto? And if you look at what's happening with things like Bitcoin and the collaborative economies that are sort of developing whole new models of financial transactions, right? I mean, is at some point, is this going to supersede our global sense of value in some way? And if so, what could the future look like if, for example, these new transaction models are married to these new creation models?
I don't know. My take is this is going to be another arrow in the quiver. I don't think it's going to supersede. I think it's going to be an adjunct and a very important adjunct. The other thing that I would add, and Bastian might have more visibility into this than I do. We started off with a quote when we gave the presentation from Thomas Friedman, just talking about the way that the global workforce is evolving, right? He had this take about the middle class and that sort of because of globalization and because of IT, okay, those Western countries which sort of had a lock on things don't have a lock on things anymore. So if you're in the middle class, you have to do much better than you had to in the past because you're competing against everybody around the world. That's sort of the downside. The upside is you have access now wherever you are, okay, to work on very interesting problems, okay, and get your work out there in a much more meaningful way than you had before. And so there's a real upside. And so independent, okay, of businesses, okay, the global workforce is going to change, right? Mm. It is, if you compare it to, the peer-to-peer financial system changes, that Bitcoin and those things, you're going to have a much more peer-to-peer sort of model where people are going to be looking at ideas, okay, not in some hierarchies anymore, but things are going to be. It's a level playing field. If you're competing on a really interesting opportunity for GE, okay, at Javoto, okay, whether you're in Vietnam or Omaha, okay, you're on a peer-to-peer sort of level playing field, and your ideas are going to be shared. That's good news and bad news, right? I mean, you're on a flat sort of playing surface, but you're getting attention across, okay, in a much more meaningful way, so organizations can see what you're doing in a much more meaningful way. And I don't know how that's going to lead, but it is going to change things in a pretty dramatic way for all of us who are workers and contributing ideas. I think that is a big change, and that is sort of that's social media for real, kind of. I mean, that is saying, how is that going to change our working lives? It is, our working lives will change as a result. We'll have we won't go through the same sort of processes that we went through, okay, being apprentices at various organizations on the way. We will have faster tracks in some ways, and it'll hurt us in some ways, right? And I think that is that is a perspective that is going to play itself out, right, in the next 10 years.
Bastian, what's the future hold?
So I think the future, personally, for my life, very bright.
Picking up Legos for the next few years.
I think Pete mentioned it. Like the way we work is fundamentally changing. It will be a challenge for individuals across the globe, especially in Western countries. You have to be willing to work much more flexibly. You have to be much more proactive when it comes to decision making, where you spend your time, how you want to be involved. Therefore, we need a new kind of security net for millions of people working in these environments in the future. We need policy, we need process, we need interfaces. Like the law that we are looking at today, at least in Germany, from my point of view, and in the US, is not living up to these new ways of organizing work, from copyright law to insurance. I do see interesting models rising, like freelancers union. I see like a lot of people are peer organizing security for themselves. They're trying to gain a voice. So this will definitely increase. I think for those who consider themselves a proactive, creative person, they will never be replaced by machines or computer programs, and they will probably prosper in these new environments, whereas others will probably face tougher challenges.
Well, someone joked on one of our recent conversations that you need a person to turn the machine on. I've always thought that was pretty good, but that's a very promising future. I think that it is we interviewed not too long ago Shel Israel on his book, and Shel talks a lot about these collaborative projects in the age of context, and I think I think this is what will be the countervailing and positive force to make a better world for our children as I'm sorry to mention it again, climate change and other factors begin to become, and already are becoming, serious global threats. So it's good to know that we have the technologies in hand to be able to solve some of these problems. And I think it's going to be interesting to see what it does to our business models in general. So thank you, gentlemen. So I'm sorry, Peter, last word?
No, I was going to say, I agree. Our business models will change. I agree with you. I don't know how they'll change, but they will. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank a very active audience. Thank you, Ken. I invite everyone to join the book club and interact more with Peter and Bastian in the discussion area, as well as get their book and 5 other really fabulous books this year. And I want to get you guys to come to Social Shakeup in the fall. This is going to be a big topic of what we're going to be talking to our audience about in person and live in Atlanta. So we can talk about that later. Thank you so much for today, though.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robin, for organizing. I say goodbye from Berlin, Germany. It's getting
New York City.
Yes.
You can go pick up Legos now.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.